These things should be a teachable moment that will enable everyone to understand that yes, there were some winners in the story of the American frontier, but there were some losers too. They lost everything. They lost their lives. They lost their communities. They lost their land and became peons to the conquerors. That's the story of John Sutter. It's a story of the conquest of the world by other peoples who cared not for the welfare of the natives, who they enslaved, abused, and supplanted.
One thing I think scholars, public history institutions have probably gotten right about Sutter from the beginning is that he's representative of something that it's really important we all understand. Up to this point, I think a lot of what we've understood that to be has been distorted. We've emphasized the wrong things about what he represents, but he's someone that I think should still occupy our attention if we're very serious about trying to understand the past, especially of this region. And someone I think we have to rethink collectively the parts about his personality and understand exactly what he was at the center of.
I think we're at a unique point in American history where we're having a reckoning with our past. And Sutter, along with a lot of other figures right now, he represents this antiquated way of thinking about the United States. The United States as a place was something to be conquered, because it's a fact of life that he was majorly responsible for the colonization and settlement of California. We can't deny that fact. And he's not being canceled or whatever you want to call it, but instead we're having a reckoning with what his legacy is and what he's responsible for.
I would hope that people really understand who he is. And I think for me and where we're at in the time of the world nowadays is that for my people, it's all about representation. And we should have the correct representation representing the history of California. And a man like John Sutter, to me, is not the symbol that not only for my own people, but I think the greater people of this state should not be praising.
Sutter was Swiss, but he was actually born in Germany. His father was a kind of managerial type. He ran a paper mill for a Swiss company. He always maintained his Swiss citizenship, and eventually Sutter settled in Switzerland, found a Swiss girl to marry, and he went into business on his mother-in-law's money. And as so frequently happened with Sutter, in fact, it always happened with Sutter, I describe him in my book as the worst businessman in the history of capitalism. He went broke. He found himself deeply in debt. He had a wife and 5 children, no way to support him, and the possibility of, losing everything. And he decided it would be best to leave, and eventually made his way to the United States.
Is John Sutter a colonizer? I think the answer to that question is absolutely yes, he was. And it's often reported kind of cavalierly that Sutter came into this wilderness just by himself without any means to impose his will. And nothing could really be further from the truth. He came into the region with sanction, with charter, and the native people in the region very much understood by that point what that charter represented. And so native people, from the moment Sutter sets foot, are dealing with this new power dynamic that Sutter brings to the region. And they have to grapple with it because of the imbalance of power and forces at work.
Sutter was an impressive-looking guy. He was well-dressed. He had a military bearing. He spoke well. He spoke several languages. He was someone who looked like he was quite something. He certainly tried to portray himself as being quite something.
So he comes in with some sanction, with some power. He's intent on realizing that power in a commercial sense, in a political sense. So how does he go about doing this? The pragmatic strain of Sutter is that he recognizes there's benefits if he can somehow harness native labor potential.
They see him as an outside force who has arrived with intentions to control them, which he does.
When John Sutter arrived in the Sacramento Valley, it was devastating to local tribal communities. It absolutely wrecked the ecosystem of the Sacramento Valley, but as part of that, tribal people who are inherently symbiotic with the ecosystem were equally disrupted. And when it actually came to Sutter himself, his philosophy was, you'll come work for me, or I'll make you come work for me.
And when Sutter got wind of any sort of rebellion in the Indian community, he dealt with them in the most ruthless ways imaginable. He would march at night, he would surround an Indian community, sometimes he took cannons, and he would simply attack without warning. He'd kill however many Indians he thought was necessary until they surrendered.
If he encountered a village that wasn't willing to work with him, he would burn down their roundhouse. And for our tribal communities, that roundhouse that's the center of our community, it's the center of our power. That's where we practice religion, we practice community, practice ceremony. And for him to come in and say, you're gonna come work for me or I'm gonna burn your roundhouse down, that's an act of cultural terrorism.
You can imagine how you would feel being awakened at dawn with someone shelling your house. That was how Sutter introduced himself to some of the people of the Sacramento Valley. Some others quickly established peaceful relations with him and didn't get that kind of treatment. But everyone, every Indian in the valley understood if they didn't cooperate with Sutter, they were subject to this kind of treatment.
Indigenous people have always been just viewed as something to be consumed and then done away with.
The ways that it's different from how it was when Sutter actually built it was that it's a lot more regular looking. It never would have looked like such a neat series of structures. This was a concept of architects and builders in the 1890s of what an 1840s building might have looked like. After the 1840s, Sutter's Fort deteriorated really quickly. It's an adobe building, and adobe needs constant maintenance to remain in place. Most of the fort sort of melted away, or the walls were torn down until only the central building was left. The central building is more or less the original building that was constructed during the 1840s. Everything else was reconstructed in the 1890s under the leadership of a group called the Native Sons of the Golden West. Their feeling about what they were doing with California history was that they were preserving California history, and I believe the exact phrase was, as God gave it to the white man. It was not about anyone else's history. It was very much about the California myth. And so that was the guiding idea behind reconstructing this fort, and it's part of the DNA of the reconstructed Sutter's Fort, is that this was intended to memorialize a very specific and erroneous idea about history.
For a long time, the typical visitor experience that most people have had at Sutter's Fort has been some kind of exposure to what we call living history concepts. So people dressed in period attire, representing for most of Sutter's Fort's history a very rosy understanding of what the pioneer experience was like in the 1840s. That kind of interpretive experience is narrow, it's untruthful, it diminishes and distorts the Native American experience that happened at the time, and also the Native American experience that continues to happen to this day.
I haven't been back to Sutter's Fort unless it's something for the Honors Elders Day or if I'm going to the California Indian Museum. do not have anything nice to say about it. To me, it's almost like going to a cemetery. I do my best to stay away from it only when it's necessary for me to be there.
A few workers, a hoist, and a high-powered chisel was all it took. From atop a pedestal to lying in a flatbed, the statue of John Sutter was taken down, and some say good.
He was the American dream. He came here, he settled land, he built a fortune, he lived the American dream, and we should celebrate him for that. But in retrospect, he didn't really do those things. He caused mass violence, murder, genocide is what he was responsible for. So to have a statue of somebody that's removed from that entire context doesn't make a lot of sense to celebrate it in a public space.
The question is, how do we envision Sutter's Fort going forward? And the vision of state parks is that Sutter's Fort can be a place where people come to examine, interrogate, and ultimately learn about 19th century history in a way that we haven't really provided at that site. The changes we anticipate making are really aimed at opening that story up, of using Sutter's Fort as a laboratory for learning, a place for Native people not only feel welcome, but where they feel empowered to come tell their stories. I think we have a long ways to go, and it's something we as state parks have to earn, but we think ultimately it can be a place for real healing too, for people who have had very emotional, personal experiences and have told us in our development of our current work how they would never want to set foot at Sutter's Fort. And I think success for us will be when we can reach people who have had that type of experience. But there's a lot of work to do.
If you truly want to allow that to be a place of healing, then I would say to get Indigenous people involved in that. Because again, who are you trying to heal? Are you trying to heal this state's reputation? Or are you trying to truly heal the Indigenous people and how we feel towards that place?